And welcome back to the second part of week 3 of Philosophy of Religion. Now, while it's common for proofs of God's existence to be given names like cosmological argument or teleological argument, the one we're going to look at in this podcast doesn't have an official name. So I'm going to call it the argument from universal aseity. And it was devised in 1755. And it's a proof that not many people have heard of. Probably because not many people have heard of the person who devised it, a maverick French philosopher called André-Pierre Legui de Prémonval. He's very little known, which means his work is very little known. Which is a shame, because some of his ideas are really very clever. And I think his proof of God's existence is ingenious. And remember, this is coming from an agnostic. Now, in order to explain why I think it's ingenious, I'm going to have to take a rather elliptical approach rather than just dive straight in. Because I think the best way to understand it and hopefully appreciate it for what it is to put it into context. And that means getting a sense of the whole enterprise of proving God's existence in the early modern period, and the role this played in the birth of atheism, and the problem that beset virtually all of the proofs of God's existence that were developed at that time and since. So I'm going to start there, and then I'll turn to the argument for universal aseity. Now, I should explain a few things before I start. First of all, when I talk of proofs of God's existence, I mean arguments for God. So we've been through that in the last segment. But just to be clear, proofs does not mean logical demonstrations in the way that we tend to use the word today. It just means arguments for God's existence. By God, I'm going to mean a supreme being that's omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, even though, as we've seen in previous weeks, such a conception of God is very difficult to elicit from any sacred scriptures. Nevertheless, it is the concept of God with which most philosophers work. So by God, that's what I mean, an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good being. And by early modern period, I mean roughly 1650 to the 1750s. If it makes sense at all to speak of a golden age for proofs of God, then the early modern period would surely be it. Back then, hundreds of thinkers advanced proofs of God, making it almost an industry. And these proofs were developed for a whole host of different reasons. But for now, our concern is with those aimed at the bogeyman of early modernity, namely the atheist. Now, the atheist was a huge concern to religious thinkers in early modern times. And a lot of works were written about how to combat atheism and win the atheist around. Or how to win some of them around anyway. The thinking was that there were different kinds of atheist, some of which could be won round, some not. The two kinds of atheist identified by early modern thinkers were practical atheists and rational atheists. Practical atheists, or atheists of the heart, were thought to be people with poor morals, who lived as if there were no God. The thinking was that such people wanted there not to be a God because they didn't want to be held accountable for their debauched lifestyle. And so strong was their desire for there not to be a God that they convinced themselves there wasn't one. So here again we see the idea of wishful thinking coming up. But the general thinking back then was that such self-delusion was likely to come undone at some point, most likely on the deathbed. So that's the first kind of atheist recognized by early modern thinkers. And the second kind were rational atheists, or atheists of the mind. And these were thought to be those who had rejected God on intellectual grounds. Such atheists were thought to hold that a naturalistic explanation of the world was sufficient, so there was no need to appeal to any kind of supernatural God. Rational atheists were also thought to take the existence of evil as evidence against a God, and hold a dim view about the usefulness of organized religion. So those are the two kinds of atheists that were widely discussed in the early modern period. It's very difficult to know how many atheists of each kind there actually were back then. No one self-identified as a rational atheist until the second half of the 18th century. And no one self-identified as a practical atheist at all, which is pretty obvious when you think about it. No one's going to say, look, I've got poor morals and live as if there's no God, are they? It's not going to happen. So for much of the early modern period, there was little to no evidence of the existence of atheists, or little to no written evidence anyway, and for the most part their existence was a matter of speculation, rumour and hearsay. The atheists that were around kept a pretty low profile. And this led some early modern thinkers to say that there were no atheists at all, of either kind. Other early modern thinkers said that there were only practical atheists. Hardly anyone believed that there were any rational atheists. And yet, this kind of atheist got a lot of attention. And this was because a practical atheist, by definition, wasn't someone you could reason with, whereas a rational atheist was. So the rational atheist became the target of religious thinkers throughout the early modern period. So I should point out that everything I say about atheists from now on is about rational atheists. So when I say atheist, I mean rational atheist. Now, the fact that such thinkers were rare, or even non-existent back then, didn't stop theists thinking about them and the views that they might hold. And in fact, theists sketched out the profile of the atheist in great detail. And they did this because they were trained in disputation. If you've ever read any Aquinas, you'll know what this involves. Essentially, disputation is a method of reaching truths by thoroughly examining the arguments on both sides. So first you lay out positive arguments for your thesis, and then you lay out objections to these arguments, and then you respond to each of these objections in turn. And the idea is that this makes your thesis very secure, because you've shown the positive arguments in its favour, and you've also shown that the objections don't undermine it. And this was the method taught in universities throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. So those in the 17th and 18th centuries were very skilled in it. And this is how they approached the question of God's existence. They would offer an argument in favour, and then they would deal with any and all objections. So they were used to the practice of tackling objections to their own views. Obviously, in the ideal scenario, they would consider the objections of real opponents. But if there weren't any real opponents to their views, then they were encouraged to invent them. Quite literally, imagine an opponent and then put objections into his or her mouth. But there was even more to it than just coming up with objections that these imaginary opponents might make. On top of that, one would often outline the position that these imaginary opponents might take, because then it would be clear what would motivate their objections. And the whole point of this was that theists could then refute all possible objections to their view and refute the entire atheist position, and so put their own view on a firmer footing. A very good example of this comes from a book published in 1684 by a French philosopher called Jacques Aseity. His book was called Treatise on the Truth of the Christian Religion. And in that book he promised to tackle the strongest objections of the atheist on his way to proving the existence of God and Christianity. And this despite him stating explicitly at the start that there were no atheists. So he's about to refute the atheist position despite saying he doesn't believe there are any atheists. Despite thinking there weren't any atheists, Aseity painted a very clear picture of the views he thought an atheist would hold. So he said the atheist would attribute all operations of nature to natural forces. He said, the atheist would say that matter was uncreated and eternal, and so it existed necessarily. And he said, the atheist would say that matter contained within itself the power to move, and that particular arrangements of matter would naturally give rise to thinking and consciousness. Now, some of this sketch of the atheist was drawn from the thinking of a handful of ancient Greek thinkers, but a good bit of it was a product of Abady's own imagination, concocted specifically so he could refute it. And other theists did the same thing. They would put words and ideas into the mouths of atheists, while simultaneously insisting that there weren't any atheists. The atheist was therefore something of a creation of theists, designed as a foil, a foe to be vanquished, and vanquished by argument, specifically by proofs of the existence of God. And when proofs were directed at atheists, they had a twofold aim. First of all, to win around any atheist there might be lurking around, by showing them that atheism was intellectually untenable. And the second aim of the proofs was to stop anyone becoming an atheist in the future, again, by showing that it was just an untenable position. And in this, of course, the proofs failed. There may or may not have been any atheists in the 17th century, but in the 18th century there certainly were. I'll just mention three obvious examples. In 1729, a French priest called Jean Mellier died, and among his papers were 3 copies of an atheist manifesto he referred to as his testament. In 1770, Baron d'Holbach published his System of Nature, an explicitly atheistic work which explained the world naturalistically and rejected God's existence. And Diderot, the encyclopedist, wrote a number of atheistic works which he left with sympathetic friends to publish after his death in 1784. And Diderot is sometimes said to be the first to self-identify as an atheist in the early modern period. Now, it's interesting to note just how much the atheism of Mellier, Holbach and Diderot was prefigured in the writings of theists like Abady. These real-life atheists endorsed ideas and positions that had been developed by theists explicitly to refute on their way to proving the existence of God. In depicting atheists and their views in such vivid detail, it's tempting to think that theists effectively created a golem that they unwittingly brought to life, for the very atheists they talked about and described in such detail would soon become real. And in fact, there's a line of thought which says that the atheism of Mellier, Holbach, Diderot and others was effectively created by the very theists who sought to prevent it from arising in the first place. The thinking goes that these theists developed sophisticated natural philosophies and sophisticated objections to theism just to put in the mouths of imaginary opponents. And so sophisticated were these natural philosophies and objections that they were later adopted by real-life atheists. Now, although I've got some sympathies with this line of thinking, our concern isn't with whether early modern theists were accidentally responsible for the emergence of atheists, or for creating the naturalistic philosophies that such atheists would eventually adopt. Instead, our concern is with how the theists of the early modern period sought to combat atheists, that class of thinker that would later be realized in the flesh by Mellier, Holbach and Diderot. In other words, our concern is with the proofs of God's existence, as these proofs were the weapons that theists used to combat atheism. And as I say, they failed to stop it from getting a foothold, and they failed spectacularly. But what I'm interested in is why they failed. Well, no doubt there are many reasons why they failed, but I'm going to focus on one in particular, which is this. The proofs that theists developed, polished and rehearsed again and again, shared a common design flaw, which meant that they never stood a chance of winning around a real-life atheist. The flaw is that they contained premises or assumptions that could only be accepted by theists and not by the atheists they were aimed at. And we'll see this by looking at the two most widely used proofs against the atheists, which today we call the cosmological argument and the design argument. And what we'll see is that irrespective of any logical flaws or internal problems that these proofs might have, they simply fail to take the atheists seriously. And because of that, they're a perfect example of how not to argue against an opponent. Now, to show this, let's start with the cosmological argument. Now, we've already been through this in some detail in the last podcast, where we looked at the Kalam argument and we looked at the Leibniz's version of this argument. But we also saw that the cosmological argument isn't a single argument. It's rather a family of arguments that all follow roughly the same form. So in essence, a cosmological argument is one that begins with the existence of some feature or aspect of reality, or even the entire universe, and then it works back to God as the ultimate explanation for it. Some cosmological proofs focus on motion, some focus on change, some focus on contingency, and there are more esoteric ones as well. So we've already seen, as I say, a couple of examples of this. We've seen the Kalam argument, we've seen Leibniz's version. But rather than go over those again, let's consider a couple of different versions of the cosmological argument. And we'll draw these from various early modern works of apologetics. So the first one we'll look at is based on motion. And there you'll see I've put the argument into premises and conclusion form. So this version of the argument starts by noting that there's motion in the universe. It then says that motion cannot be explained with reference to the nature of matter. And the conclusion is that therefore the cause of motion must lie in a being outside the material universe, namely God. Now the key part of this argument is the claim that motion cannot be explained with reference to the nature of matter. Essentially, the argument assumes that matter is in itself inert. In other words, matter will move if it's pushed, but it will remain stationary if not. So the fact that there's motion in the universe needs to be explained. There must be something that gave it a push to get it moving in the first place. And this something cannot be made of matter itself, otherwise you'd end up having to ask how it got moving, and so on. So the argument tries to show that there must be something that is not itself made of matter, but which put all of the matter in the universe into motion. And this something is God. Now this was a very popular form of cosmological argument, used by lots of different theists in the early modern period to tackle atheism. But despite its popularity, the argument clearly doesn't have what it takes to convince a true atheist. As I mentioned, the key part of the argument is the claim that motion cannot be explained with reference to the nature of matter. Now theists, they generally believe that matter is inert, and they believed it needed an initial push to set it in motion. But the atheist was thought to believe the opposite of that. One of the views the atheist was thought to hold was that matter contained within itself the power to move. And when real-life atheists came about, that's precisely the view they did hold. So, the cosmological argument based on motion was never likely to win round an atheist, because it rests on a premise that such an atheist would not accept. And what's curious here is that theists knew full well that atheists would deny this premise, because when they painted their picture of the atheist, they envisaged the atheist denying it. And from that it should have been clear that the argument could only be accepted by theists who already agreed with all the premises. And we find the same issue with another version of the cosmological argument. And this one is based on the contingency of the universe. In other words, on the fact that the universe might not have existed. So, the argument starts by noting that the universe is contingent. It then says, when we have a situation where something may exist or may not exist, there must be some cause which determines it to exist rather than not to exist. But this cause cannot itself be contingent, otherwise it would be in a position where it too may exist or may not exist, and there would have to be something else which determines whether it exists or not. And as this cause cannot be contingent, it must be necessary. In other words, it absolutely, positively has to exist. And this cause is God. So that's a second form of cosmological argument, this time based on the contingency of the universe. Again, it's the kind of argument that a theist could readily accept because the premises of the argument are very much in line with theistic thinking of the day. But again, it's the kind of argument an atheist would not accept because the premises are not in line with the views that atheists were thought to hold. Specifically, atheists were thought to hold that the universe was eternal and existed necessarily. It always has existed and always will exist, and this could not be otherwise. That was thought to be the atheist view. So atheists would not accept that the universe is contingent at all. And of course, anyone denying that the universe is contingent is clearly going to be unmoved by an argument that starts off by saying that it is, which is precisely what this form of cosmological argument does. So again, this form of cosmological argument doesn't speak to atheists so much as actually just talk past them. Okay, let's turn now to the other kind of proof that was widely used in the early modern period to tackle atheism. And this one is the teleological proof or design argument. As its name suggests, it seeks to infer the existence of a designer from the order or adaptedness, the apparent design that is found in the universe. Again, this is a family of different arguments really, rather than a single argument. So it comes in many different forms, but most commonly it focused on the bodies of plants, animals and humans. It would focus on the intricate parts of these bodies and the ways these intricate parts were all related so as to enable the body to function. Other versions of the argument focused on order in the cosmos, like the arrangements of planets on the same plane, or the orderly orbits of planets around the sun, or the laws of nature. In each case, the argument held that the order in question pointed to the existence of a designer, identified as God. And the design argument was a favourite of theists because it was perceived to have broad appeal. The fact it didn't use metaphysical terms or abstract reasoning meant it could potentially appeal to those without a philosophical background, and so it could reach those the cosmological argument couldn't touch. But, in spite of its popularity among theists, it's hard to see how the design argument could possibly trouble a committed atheist. All forms of the argument assume that the orderly features of the world could not be explained naturalistically, and so needed to be explained by appealing to a supernatural designer. But this is precisely the assumption that atheists could be expected to deny, given that they were widely thought to hold that the order in the universe could be explained naturalistically. So their view was that there was no need to look outside the universe for an explanation of the order that was found within it. In essence, all cosmological and design arguments assume that we need to look outside of the universe to explain the universe, or some feature of it. But this is precisely the assumption that theists figured that an atheist would deny. And it was precisely the assumption that real-life atheists did deny. So these kinds of arguments didn't and couldn't touch atheists. Because they contain premises that theists would accept and atheists would not, both the cosmological and design arguments seem more suited to reassuring theists in their own belief than to winning round atheists. And the situation reminds me of that old joke. Why do philosophers in different buildings always disagree? Because they're working from different premises. Boom, boom. But hopefully this helps to explain a little bit about why the proofs for God's existence have had such a poor track record in converting people. Hopefully, by pointing out this design flaw that's inherent in the cosmological and design arguments, we've seen they just do not speak to atheists. So it's not surprising that atheists, when they did emerge, would find such arguments unconvincing and easy to ignore. Okay, so I want to thank you for bearing with me so far, because I realise I haven't said anything yet about the argument from universal aseity. But all of this background, all of this context will be very useful, not only for understanding the proof itself and why it's structured the way that it is, but also for understanding its ingenuity. As I mentioned very briefly at the start, the argument from universal aseity was developed by a French philosopher called André-Pierre Leguy de Prémonval. And it's wholly original with him. No one else, as far as I know, ever developed anything like it. Now, he's not a well-known philosopher, so it would be useful to introduce him before we get into the nuts and bolts of the argument. Now, I'd love to be able to show you a picture of him, but unfortunately, I've not been able to find one. So what can we say about Prémonval? Well, he was born in Paris in 1716. He died in Berlin in 1764. From 1752 until his death, he was a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Berlin, in the class of speculative philosophy, metaphysics in other words. And the Royal Academy of Sciences in Berlin, that was the institution that Leibniz had established way back in 1700. And the original building still exists, as we can see on the slide there. And in fact, I went to visit it a couple of years ago, as you can see. Not just the building still exists, but the institution still exists. But it's now in a building about half a mile away from the old one, and it's called something different now. Anyway, all of Prémonval's philosophical works were written during his 12 years as a member of the Berlin Academy. Before arriving in Berlin in 1752, he'd had an interesting, if undistinguished life. When he was 21, he made a name for himself in Paris as a self-styled professor of mathematics. He would offer free lectures on mathematics in a room in his own house, and these lectures came to a sudden end in 1744, when he moved to Switzerland. And it's likely that he moved either because he was chased out of France by the enemies that he'd made, or because he wanted to elope with one of his students. There are different accounts. And over the next 8 years, he would move several more times, to Germany, then to Holland, then back to Germany. And all the while, he supported himself by working as a proofreader and publishing a number of books that would be classed today as belles lettres. And once he became a member of the Berlin Academy in 1752, he quickly became one of its most prolific members. So some statistics might be helpful. In his 12 years as a member, he attended 356 of the Academy's weekly sessions. He delivered 26 memoirs or papers. 25 of those were published. Many of them were published in the Academy's proceedings. Some were published in Prémonval's own books. And in his 12 years as a member, Prémonval published 5 philosophical books. And the main ones are Thoughts on Freedom, on Chance Under the Rule of Providence and Philosophical Views, a 2-volume collection of various essays. And a number of Premalval's essays were concerned with atheism, or more specifically, with the question of what would it take to convince an atheist that there really is a God. And I think that's a really interesting question that he should ask himself in that way. What would it take to convince an atheist that there really is a God? He spent a lot of time thinking about this question. And this led him to look at certain proofs for the existence of God. In particular, what we would now call the design argument, the one that we met a few minutes ago. Now, Premalval had a lot to say about the design argument. None of it was good, though. In fact, he was scathing about the argument. And this wasn't because he denied that God had had a hand in shaping the universe in some way. He thought that was true. He just thought the argument itself was hopeless. And hopeless because it had no chance of converting an atheist. Or at least an atheist who followed the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, in supposing that the universe consisted of an infinity of atoms that moved about randomly for all eternity. That was the view Epicurus had held, and it was a view that in early modernity a lot of theists were concerned that atheists might adopt. So Premalval argued that any atheist who believed that, who did follow Epicurus in believing that, would not be impressed with an argument that tried to prove the existence of God from any of the order that was found in the universe. Why? Well, he thought such an atheist, an Epicurean atheist, would say that all of the order in the universe could be adequately explained on the Epicurean hypothesis. After all, an infinity of atoms moving around randomly for all eternity would eventually produce orderly structures somewhere. In fact, many, many times. And would eventually behave in orderly ways. Again, many, many times. So the atheist would think that she could explain all of the order of the universe without having to invoke a designer. And that, in Premalval's view, made the design argument hopeless. As he saw it, the whole point of the design argument was that it was supposed to present an atheist with a good reason to believe in God. But it couldn't possibly do that because the atheist was able to explain the world's order on her own principles without having to resort to a designer God. And that's precisely the same problem I mentioned a few minutes ago. As I noted, the design argument was structured in such a way as to pretty much guarantee that it would not convince an atheist. And Premalval saw that. And as far as he was concerned, that made it a pretty useless proof. The key point here is that for Premalval, the test for any proof of God's existence is whether it could convince an atheist. And as far as he was concerned, all of the traditional proofs failed that test. So we're talking about the design argument, the cosmological argument, and so on. For him, it wasn't so much that these proofs were logically faulty, but rather that they all contained premises that atheists would not accept. And because of this, no atheist would be convinced by these proofs. What was needed, he thought, was a different kind of proof. A proof that was based on principles that atheists already accepted. A proof that would show them that if they considered their own principles carefully enough, they would realize that they were in fact committed to the existence of God after all. And it's precisely such a proof that Premalval tried to develop. He didn't give it a name, but as I mentioned at the start, I'm going to call it the argument from universal aseity. And we're going to look at the argument throughout the rest of this podcast. So I'll give you a little bit of background to it, then I'll outline it, and then I'll ask the question who exactly the proof was aimed at. So let's begin with some background. So the argument from universal aseity appeared in an essay called The Theology of Being that Premovall delivered at the Berlin Academy in 1755. And the essay was then published in the Academy's proceedings and in his own book, Philosophical Views. Premovall actually describes the argument as an ad hominem argument against the atheist. Now, these days, the term ad hominem is usually used to describe an argument that tries to attack the character or motives of a particular person. So if I were to say, Smith claims X, but Smith is stupid, therefore X is false. Right? So if I gave that kind of argument, we would call that an ad hominem argument because it's aimed at the person rather than the claim that the person is making. It's the philosophical equivalent of playing the man rather than the ball. But in Premovall's day, the term ad hominem wasn't used in this way. Instead, an ad hominem argument was one that was based on the principles of one's opponent, or on what one could get one's opponent to concede. And Premovall's argument is exactly like this. So it starts with a principle that he believed atheists already accept, which is this: that all existing beings are uncreated, so they exist of themselves necessarily. So this means that all existing beings have always existed and always will exist. Premovall calls this the principle of universal aseity, aseity being the property of existing necessarily. Now, Premovall notes that theists typically ascribe aseity only to God. So only God has the property of aseity, so only God exists necessarily. That's what theists thought. But as atheists extend it to all beings, so atheists think that all things exist necessarily. Because atheists do that, Premovall follows suit. He grants atheists their own principle. He says, aseity, which people restrict to the first being, God, I agree with the atheist to extend to all beings. So here we see the ad hominem structure of the argument. He's agreeing with the atheist principle, and he'll build his argument on the back of that. And he sometimes presents the principle in terms of substance rather than beings. So when he does that, he says that the atheist is committed to the following two points. They will say any substance has not passed from non-being to being, and any substance cannot pass from non-being to being. Now, when Premovall talks about beings or substances, he doesn't mean compound things like tables, chairs, and things like that. Obviously, the last thing he wants to do is say that atheists believe that objects like that are uncreated. Because, no atheist is ever going to say that tables, chairs have always existed and always will exist, right? No. What Premovall means by beings or substances are simple things. Things that have no parts into which they can be broken down. So these could be material things, in which case I guess we're talking about atoms in the original sense of the word, as something that is literally unsplittable. The fundamental building blocks of material objects, whatever these might be. But he also wants to include things like souls here as well, because souls were typically thought of as simple, inasmuch as they cannot be split in two or broken down into parts, because they just don't have parts. So when he outlines the atheist principle that all existing beings have always existed and always will exist, he's thinking of it applying to these simple beings, whatever they might be, atoms, souls, things like that. So the atheist principle says, in effect, that these beings, these substances, are uncreated. They didn't pop into existence at some point, and they don't pop out of existence either. Instead, they have always existed, and they always will. And that's the principle of universal aseity, which, as I say, is intended to be a principle that atheists already accept. The next part of Premalval's argument is designed to get the atheist to go further than this, to accept the view that all possible beings exist necessarily. Key to this step is Premalval's belief that atheists will not draw a distinction between a possible being and an existing being, or at least that atheists won't be prepared to draw a distinction like that once they really think about it. Instead, he thinks atheists will say that if a being is possible, then it exists. So Premalval assumes that the atheist will define a possible being in the standard way, where possible just means not containing or implying a contradiction. So for the atheist, as for pretty much everybody else back then, a possible being is one that does not contain or imply a contradiction. So let's just imagine a couple of simple beings, which are the sort of beings that Premalval is talking about. Let's suppose simple being A is a square. This seems possible, right? There doesn't look to be any contradiction in the idea of it being square. Now suppose simple being B, which is a square triangle. Well, now here, this isn't possible, is it? Obviously, there is a contradiction in the idea of something being both a square and a triangle at the same time. So hopefully that makes the point clear then between what counts as a possible being and what wouldn't count as a possible being. But why would the atheist suppose that all possible beings exist? Well, Premalval argues like this. He says that on the atheist position, whatever exists necessarily, because it contains the property of aseity. But it would be absurd to suppose that some possible beings have this property of aseity, and so exist necessarily, while other possible beings don't have this property, and so therefore cannot exist at all. Those ones would effectively be impossible. So after all, how could the atheist explain that one possible being exists necessarily, while another possible being doesn't exist at all, and in fact can't exist? Or, as he puts it, this is the quotation at the bottom, we conceive it absurd to suppose that some non-contradictory beings have eternal and necessary existence, and impossible that others have it. So whether the atheist is aware of it or not, the principle of universal aseity commits her to the view that all possible beings exist, and exist necessarily. Now this raises the question of how many beings we're talking about. How large is the sphere of possibility? How many beings are possible, and therefore actual? Well, Premalval quickly supposes that it must be an infinity, on the grounds that it would be absurd to think that the number of possible beings, beings that do not contain a contradiction, is finite. So he figures that the atheist is committed to the view that the number of possible beings is infinite. But what does it mean to say that the number of possible beings is infinite? Well, to really understand what the atheist is committed to, we need to understand the notion of infinity involved here. And this leads Premalval to draw a distinction between two kinds of infinity. On the one hand, there's mathematical infinity, and on the other, what he calls supreme infinity. Mathematical infinity applies to things that are quite literally never-ending, without a defined endpoint. So, like the number of minutes that have elapsed in an eternal universe. So, if the universe were eternal, and if we start at the present day and we count the minutes that have already elapsed, the counting would never stop, because no matter what number of minutes we reach, there would always be another one to add. That's mathematical infinity. Supreme infinity, on the other hand, Premalval defines as follows. Supreme infinity is that to which nothing can be added, he says, because it contains all. So a supreme infinity is the complete sum of whatever is at issue. It could be numbers, it could be moments, it could be beings. Or as he puts it, supreme infinity is not susceptible of any degree. It is the complete sum of possible, finite, and infinite individuals. It is the all in the genus under consideration. So if we're talking about numbers, it's all possible numbers. If we're talking about beings, it's all possible beings. Anyway, if the atheist is committed to the view that the number of possible beings is infinite, which kind of infinity are we talking about? And Promoval figures it must be supreme infinity, because the principle of universal aseity, the principle the atheists accept, is just another way of saying that all possible beings exist necessarily, rather than that an indeterminate number of them do. The clue is in universal, so it applies to them all. So Premoval calls the collection of all possible beings an omnitude, to indicate that it's a true totality consisting of all. And he thinks that the atheist is committed to the actual existence of the omnitude of beings, even if the atheist isn't explicitly aware of it. Or in his words, according to the principle of universal aseity, we are therefore compelled to admit the existence, indeed the eternal and necessary existence, of the complete infinity of beings which do not imply contradiction. Now, the final step in Premoval's proof effectively says that an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God must be among the infinite number of possible beings, because the idea of such a God contains or implies no contradiction. And since God is a possible being, then it follows that God exists, and exists necessarily, along with any and all other possible beings, which gives you the conclusion that God exists. But he doesn't go quite as fast as this, though. Right, so we're looking at this final step. So he starts by asking if it's possible for there to be a being that is superior to us in terms of power, wisdom, and goodness. So what he invites us to do here is imagine whether there is any contradiction in the idea of a being that has more power than a king, more wisdom than the greatest philosopher, and so on. And he doesn't think we'll find any contradiction in this. And we still won't, even if we keep extending the level of power, wisdom, and goodness of this being. If we extend power, wisdom, and goodness far enough, we reach what I guess we would call minor deities, like the gods of ancient Greece, which are vastly more powerful than we are, vastly more wise, for the most part, and vastly more benevolent. Well, in some cases anyway. Premoval thinks that we'll encounter no contradiction if we keep extending power, wisdom, and goodness, even to the point where a being has supreme power, supreme wisdom, and supreme goodness. Since we encounter no contradiction in the idea of such a being, it follows that such a being is possible. In which case, according to the argument from universal aseity, this being must necessarily exist, along with everything else that's possible. So the thrust of Premoval's argument is that atheists are compelled by their own principle to admit the existence of God. And of course, they're also compelled to admit the existence of every possible being, which could well include things like angels and demons. And Premoval's completely unfazed by this. He says, well, belief in things like that is widespread, it always has been, so it's no objection that my argument proves that they exist. So that's Premoval's argument. What I like about it is that it takes the atheist position seriously in a way that other proofs do not. It starts from premises he thinks the atheist already accepts. And as such, it reveals a degree of understanding of the atheist position that you just don't find in other proofs. And I think this aspect of it deserves further comment. More specifically, who accepted that atheist principle? Or to put it another way, who exactly is this argument aimed at? The atheist premise it starts with is very specific, isn't it? All existing beings are uncreated, so they exist of themselves necessarily. That's the atheist principle. So who believed that? Who is Premalval trying to convince? Well, I'll tell you now, I have no definitive answer to this. Part of the difficulty in figuring out who the proof is aimed at is that Premalval doesn't say. He just says that atheists accept that all existing beings are uncreated without naming any names. Another part of the difficulty is that in 1755, when Premalval offered his proof, there were very few people who were prepared to admit to being atheists, at least in print. And that would change later in the 18th century, of course, when you would get unashamedly atheist works being published by people like D'Holbach and Diderot. But in 1755, there were very, very few atheist works in print, if any. And I've certainly not been able to find any published text from which Premalval might have drawn the atheist principle. Which then brings us back to our question. Who is Premalval trying to convince? Who is his proof aimed at? And as I say, I don't have a definitive answer to this, but I do have a hypothesis. And what I'd like to do in the remainder of this podcast is outline it. My hypothesis is that Premalval aimed the proof at himself, or rather at the younger version of himself. And this was my first thought when I came across the proof several years ago, and it's worth explaining what led me to it. A little while back I said a bit about Premalval's background and life story, but there was one rather big thing that I missed out, which is that Premalval was himself an atheist for a time. And this is by his own admission. In his memoirs, he explains that he was raised as a good Catholic. He didn't have any doubts about his religion until he went to university and he started studying philosophy. And then he started to have his doubts, thanks in part to Descartes' skeptical arguments. And Premalval explains that his doubts escalated and he ended up having a long night of anguished soul-searching. And at the end of that, he was convinced that virtually everything he had believed up to that point was wrong, or even absurd. So he descended into outright skepticism and then atheism. Eventually, Premalval came to the view that skepticism was a kind of madness, and he ended up as a deist, someone who believes in a supreme being, but not of any particular revealed religion. At the age of 30, he converted to Protestantism, but he doesn't say which kind. And how sincere this conversion was, I don't know, because his thinking was much more in line with deism than it ever was with any branch of Protestantism. Anyway, my point is this. Premalval knew how atheists think because he had been one. This makes it possible that Premalval's proof may capture the sort of reasoning that led him away from atheism when he was younger. This is entirely speculative, of course. Premalval never actually says this. In fact, in his writings from the 1750s, he claims that he personally knows of God's existence through a kind of inner feeling. But he concedes that his own inner feeling won't convince anyone else that God exists, and because of that, he has to take a different approach to try to win atheists round. And his argument from universal aseity is designed to do just that. When he says that his argument is ad hominem, and that it starts from a principle that atheists themselves would accept, he rather gives the impression that he has concocted the argument for their benefit. The implication seems to be that it's just a tool designed to do a job, and that's all. But it's quite clear from reading his philosophical works that he personally endorsed all of the claims found in the argument, as well as the conclusion that God exists of necessity, along with everything else that's possible. So this is what makes me suspect his argument wasn't just something he cobbled together to try to win atheists over. I think it represents the sort of thinking that led him away from atheism. And if that's right, then his argument may have the rare distinction of being a proof of God's existence that has successfully won over an atheist, namely him.